Hello, my friends, hello, and welcome once again to Stately Vaughan Manor, where Roger and I have returned for my weekend reading report. It's time for my weekend reading report, where I talk about all the stuff I read during the past week. And I did read some stuff this week. I finished a couple books, read some things. So let's talk about it, Roger. What did I read last week anyway? Well, the first book I finished was this. This is Of One Blood, or The Hidden Self by Pauline Hopkins. I read this for Roger's Cheap Old Book Club, the cheapest book club around. Every book that Roger picks, and he's picked one for every month. Every book that Roger picks is available for free on Project Gutenberg because they're all in the public domain. You can't get any cheaper than free. And so the first book for this year for Roger's Cheap Old Book Club, it's this one, Of One Blood by Pauline Hopkins. I've got the Haunted Library of Horror Classics edition, which is put out by the Horror Writers Association. This is a really interesting book, man. A lot of stuff happens in this book. Considering how short it is, it's like 180 pages. In that 180 pages, so much weird stuff happens. I mean, this is a weird book. It was written by Pauline Hopkins, who was the editor and chief contributor to Colored American magazine. This story was serialized in Colored American magazine from 1902 to 1903. And Pauline Hopkins, like I said, she was the editor and one of the chief contributors to this magazine. It doesn't sound like the magazine was a one-woman show, but certainly it seems like she was the heart and soul of this magazine. And it sounds like it was a pretty important magazine, not only because it gave African American writers a place to contribute their fiction, and because it was a magazine that dealt with stories and concerns of African Americans. But Pauline Hopkins seemed to have been a pretty courageous person, and she wasn't afraid to write about important issues at the time, things that other magazines and other publications might shy away from. She was very vocal about the injustices, the racial injustices of the time. She spoke out against things like lynching, the lynchings that were going on in the American South. You would think everybody would be up in arms about that, but not everybody wrote about it, actually, but she did. And she wasn't afraid to be controversial. Eventually, the magazine was bought out. Pauline Hopkins was removed as editor, and the magazine immediately became much safer and steered away from any controversy. And died shortly after, because that's what the magazine was, And so once she was gone, and they went with this safer, let's not offend anybody policy, it just kind of withered away, and the readership drifted off. But it seems to have been a pretty important magazine while it was around. And this is a really interesting story, man. It's kind of wild. So the story is about a young doctor named Raoul Briggs. And he's a medical student and a doctor, and he appears to be a white person, but he is actually also of partially African American descent, which he was hiding. And part of what this book is about is how ridiculous the whole idea of race is, actually. And at the time, there was the idea that if a person had even one drop of Negro blood, then they were, black. No matter what you look like or anything, that's the way it is. And you would say, well, so what? But at this time, when racism was even worse than it is now, that was a big deal. And so much weird stuff happens in this. It's in this edition as a horror book. And she's described here as the first great female horror writer of color. But this isn't so much a horror novel, really, as it is a fantasy, I think. There are certainly horror elements in this. The supernatural is all over this book. I mean, right away and all through it, the supernatural is a huge part of it. And the character Raoul Briggs is really interested in the supernatural. But this is also kind of a lost world novel in the H. Rider Haggard tradition in a way. It kind of combines the supernatural. It's also kind of a sensation novel, like from like The Woman in White and those old Victorian sensation novels. This is kind of that as well. So there's a lot of things going on in this. And I don't want to give away the plot because it's so crazy. This book has a crazy plot. And the level of the writing is kind of at writing that would be typical for a pulp magazine in the 1920s, basically. It's pulp magazine writing. It never really rises from that as far as the writing itself. But so many crazy things happen in this book. It certainly keeps your interest. And the plot just moves forward and crazy stuff happens. And this was serialized. And certainly I think I'm not sure how the chapters were divided up, but I'm sure that when you got to the end of the chapter and the serial finished for that month, you were going to buy the next issue, because you would have to find out what's going to happen in this crazy thing. And there was at one point where there was a reveal. Something is revealed to Raoul Briggs. And my reaction was, what? What? And I had to put the book down for a minute and process what I had just read. I remember where it was. It was on page 152. And it was so crazy, this thing. And I'm like, okay. And so I picked the book back up. And the next line that I read was, because this thing is revealed to the character Raoul. And this is the next line I read. What? Almost shrieked Raoul. What? Raoul had the same reaction I did when this news was presented to him. There's some stuff going on in this book. Has a terrible villain and betrayal and ghosts and a lost civilization. I mean, there's a lot of stuff going on in Of One Blood. It's certainly an entertaining book. And it's really interesting because it is a fantasy, but it's interesting to see where this fantasy came from with Pauline Hopkins and how so much of this was inspired just by the racial injustices at the time and how the characters have to deal with those things, with those issues. Like I said, Pauline Hopkins did not shy away from that stuff. Interesting book. I highly recommend it. It's one of those books I don't think many people have heard of, but it's definitely a really interesting one. So yeah, that's the first thing I read, Of One Blood. The next thing I read was, I went back to Amber. I was reading in January, The Great Book of Amber. Wasn't able to finish it. So now I'm just reading, I'll read an Amber book or two a month until I'm finished up with all 10 books. The book I just read this week is called Blood of Amber, which is the 7th book of the Amber series, of the Amber Chronicles. It's the 2nd book in the Merlin cycle. Merlin is the son of Corwin, who was the main character in the first 5 books. And every time I've heard of this series, I always hear how the Merlin cycle is not as good as the original Corwin cycle. So far, that has not been true. Blood of Amber was fantastic. I loved every page of this book. It was so entertaining, so fast-paced, so full of action and intrigue. It's it was it was awesome. I loved it. I really enjoy this series. And so far, I mean, I've still got 3 books to go, but so far the quality has not gone down at all, in my opinion. I noticed that at this point in the series, this book was written, I think in the mid 1980s. At some point, I noticed that fewer characters are smoking. In the original books, the earlier books that took place in the 70s, everybody was smoking like always, and now nobody smokes. So Roger Zelazny, he must have quit smoking at some point writing this series, because he no longer writes about that. But all kinds of crazy things are still happening. I really like the character of Merlin, actually. He is a sorcerer, as you would need to be with that name. Born and raised in the courts of chaos. It's a lot of fun. So I'm continuing to really enjoy the Amber Chronicles. 3 books left to go. The next book I'm going to be reading is Signs of Chaos. Signs of Chaos. The next book in the Amber Chronicles that I'll be reading. And then I'll talk more about the Merlin cycle of books after I'm done reading the next 3 of those. But yeah, this continues to be great. This continues to be great. It's awesome. So yeah, there's that. And now the thing I just started reading, the book I just started reading, is The Infinite Moment by John Wyndham. This is an old mass market paperback from I think it was 1961 when this was printed. Yeah, 1961. And this is a short story collection from John Wyndham, who is best known for The Day of the Triffids and The Midwich Cuckoos. The channel Books, Songs, and Other Magic came up with a reading event for winter, the Winter of Wyndham, where every month you'll read a John Wyndham book. And so I'm a little bit behind. I need to read 2 John Wyndham books this month to catch up. But this is the one I'm reading right now, The Infinite Moment. And so, yeah, short stories. And the one I just started this morning, actually. And I'm reading a story called Consider Her Ways, which is really interesting so far. I have a feeling that this is going to be a really interesting book and probably a lot of fun to talk about, which I'll talk about next week. I should be done with it this week, one would hope, because it's not too long. It's only a couple hundred pages long. Not even that. It's 160 pages long. So I should get through this really quickly, one would hope. It depends on the week, of course. But yeah. The Infinite Moment by John Wyndham. Talk more about that next week. And of course, I've been reading Thor, reading the entire run of Thor from the early 1960s. It ran until the mid 1990s when Thor was canceled and came back a couple months later. But the original run of Thor, volume 1 of Thor, is what I'm reading. And these are some really awesome issues written by Len Wein. Art is by Walter Simonson so far in this book. Walter Simonson, who went on to become one of the greatest Thor creators ever. His run on Thor in the mid-1980s is legendary, but this is the late 70s when he first started drawing Thor. And it's great stuff. It's great stuff. It doesn't look a heck of a lot like the Thor issues that come later, but still, it's great artwork, and it's interesting stuff. So Thor continues to be really awesome. These are a bunch of Thor stories that I had never read, and there were a lot of issues of Thor that I didn't read because I didn't start reading Thor originally until Walter Simonson not only got on the book, but kind of became a hit on the book. And then I started hearing about Thor and how great Thor was. And then I started picking up Thor in the 1980s just because of Walter Simonson's work. But a lot of the stuff that came before that, I've never read. So this has been interesting. It's been interesting, this project, reading all of these issues of Thor I had never read before. And I'm still doing Strange Saturdays, where I'm reading Doctor Strange on Saturdays, Master of the Mystic Arts. So I'm reading out of this omnibus, it is a very thin Marvel omnibus because this just has the Stan Lee, Steve Ditko stories, which were very, very short stories that were originally published in Strange Tales. Strange Tales, the headliner for Strange Tales at this point is Johnny Storm. Here's Johnny Storm, the Human Torch, who has to fight the Rabble Rouser, another spell-binding villain. The Human Torch, man, he just got the best villains. The Rabble Rouser. So, but I was reading the Doctor Strange stories, which are completely awesome. I mean, just these Doctor Strange stories are so great. They were about, at this point in the stories I'm reading now, they're about 8 pages long because, they were a backup feature. But he does a lot. He can do a lot in 8 pages. He's good with these tiny little panels where Steve Ditko and Stan Lee, they could just get out so much story in a small amount of space. Of course, we have aliens. This time, Doctor Strange went up against interdimensional aliens as opposed to aliens from outer space. And of course, he has magical battles as usual, and the artwork is just great. I really think these Doctor Strange stories were the best stories that Steve Ditko ever illustrated. I mean, he was, of course, great on Spider-Man too, but for my money, Doctor Strange was the best as far as the artwork, as far as the Steve Ditko artwork was concerned. This is so much fun. I love Doctor Strange. And it's fun to revisit these stories in this omnibus. The very first Epic Collection, Doctor Strange Epic Collection, actually has the exact same contents of this volume. So yeah, if you find that, you should read that because these are great stories. And for Sundays, I'm also reading Superman. I'm reading Superman every Sunday. Haven't read Superman yet today, but last week I read a couple issues from Action Comics, including this one, Action Comics number 46. Now, the last couple stories that I read in this Epic Collection has to do with the zoo, and the next one had to do with an amusement park. Now, I've noticed with these stories from the 1940s, there were a lot of goings-on at zoos, amusement parks, and carnivals. There were a lot of those that made their appearances in Superman. Early 1940s. I guess those were great entertainment concerns. Continues to be great fun. I do really enjoy the Golden Age Superman. I'm almost done with this omnibus, and the next thing I read after this will probably not be Golden Age Superman. I'll probably jump ahead a bit and read something different from Superman's history. So much Superman to read. I'll be reading Superman the rest of my life. I'll never read it all. Never. You can't. There's too much Superman out there. And only one thing came to the manor. Not much comes to the manor anymore unless somebody sends me something. Because of the 500 book challenge, where I have to read 500 books I own before I buy any new ones. I'm not buying a lot of stuff anymore. But I did have a bunch of comic books. I still have some comic books coming that are pre-ordered. And I'm still getting Epic Collections because I collect them. I just won't count them if I read them. If they're, things that I order new. And I got this one. This is Captain America Twilight's Last Gleaming. Twilight's Last Gleaming, which is the end of Grunwald's run. Yeah, Mark Grunwald, who was the writer on Captain America for 10 years. This Epic Collection has the end of his run. When Captain America was being killed by the super soldier serum and he had to wear like an Iron Cap outfit invented by Tony Stark, so he was like Iron Man Captain America for a while, because otherwise he couldn't be Captain America because he was, dying. And yeah, so this ends his run. Of course, Captain America survived. He did die later, but then all the Marvel characters were killed and, brought back to life, because that's just something Marvel does. But, you know, 90s Captain America. And these stories were from the mid-90s, 1994 to 1995. So there you go. Captain America, Twilight's Last Gleaming. That's pretty cool. That's pretty cool. I remember reading these stories when they were new. So long ago now. And I guess that's it. I guess that's everything. I guess I'll shut up now because I've been yammering on for 20 minutes. I will catch you next time.